Sheriff Daniel Mercer was the kind of man who trusted facts, not fantasies. In the quiet town of Cedar Hollow, he was a pillar of reliability, someone people counted on to maintain order and justice. But nothing in his steady career had prepared him for the night he walked into the morgue and saw his own face staring back at him from a cold metal slab. It had started as a routine investigation. A mysterious death at the edge of town had put the sheriff on alert, and he was called to the county morgue to examine the body for any clues. The morgue was a sterile, dimly lit place, smelling faintly of antiseptic and old metal. The chill in the air seeped into his bones as he followed the coroner through the narrow corridors. As they entered the examination room, Daniel's eyes immediately locked onto a covered form on one of the slabs. The coroner pulled back the white sheet with a practiced hand, revealing a face eerily familiar. Heart pounding, Daniel stepped closer and gasped. The face beneath the sheet was his own. Frozen, he studied the still features, the same sharp jawline, the same tired eyes closed in eternal rest, the same faint scar above the left eyebrow. It was impossible. He was standing alive, breathing, and yet here lay a corpse bearing his exact likeness. "Sheriff," the coroner's voice cut through his shock. "We found this body near the river earlier today. There's no ID, but the resemblance is uncanny. We thought you should see it." Daniel could barely nod. His mind raced, struggling to reconcile the impossible sight before him. Was this a cruel prank, a case of mistaken identity, or something far more unsettling? He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cold metal beside the body, grounding himself. How is this possible?" The coroner shrugged. "We don't know. We're running tests, but nothing adds up. The body shows signs of death several hours ago, definitely dead before you arrived." Daniel's thoughts spiraled. If the body was him, then where was he? Who was the man lying on the slab? Questions collided, drowning reason in a tide of confusion and dread. He excused himself and stepped outside, gasping for fresh air. The night sky was cold and indifferent, stars obscured by drifting clouds. His reflection caught in a nearby window, alive, real, and yet somehow disconnected from the corpse he had just seen. Shaken but determined, Daniel knew he couldn't ignore what he had witnessed. The sheriff who walked Cedar Hollow's streets was the same man marked dead in the morgue, and the truth behind this haunting mystery was his responsibility to uncover. As the town slept unaware, Daniel Mercer's life had fractured, caught between two realities, where he was both living sheriff and a silent corpse, and the line between them blurred with every passing moment. Sheriff Daniel Mercer couldn't shake the image of his own lifeless face from his mind. The morgue's cold, sterile environment now haunted him like a shadow he couldn't escape. Determined to unravel the mystery, he threw himself into an investigation that quickly spiraled beyond the realm of the ordinary. He started by combing through morgue records and death certificates. No official record bore his name or matched the time he'd seen on the body's file. The coroner, Dr. Ellis, was puzzled too. "There's no paperwork connecting this body to any missing person or recent death," Ellis said, brow furrowed. "It's like it appeared out of nowhere." Daniel interviewed hospital staff and law enforcement officers who had been on duty that day, looking for any clues. None recalled any incident involving someone resembling him. No missing person reports, no unidentified bodies, nothing that could explain the bizarre double. Meanwhile, strange things began to happen around Daniel. He caught glimpses of himself where none should be, reflections that lingered too long, shadowy figures that mimicked his movements in passing windows. Sometimes, when he looked in the mirror, his reflection seemed delayed, as if caught in a subtle echo of another time or place. His radio occasionally crackled with static, then faint echoes of his own voice repeating fragments of conversations he didn't remember having. At night, he dreamt of watching himself lying still on a cold slab, powerless and silent. The sheriff found himself questioning his own sanity. Was someone impersonating him? Or was it a hallucination brought on by stress? Or was something far darker at play? The townsfolk began to notice the change too. People greeted him with hesitant eyes. Whispers followed him down the streets. Rumors swirled that the sheriff was haunted or cursed, and Daniel felt the isolation deepen. Determined to confront the truth, he sought help from Agnes Whitaker, the town's historian and keeper of old lore. She listened carefully as he described the uncanny events. There are stories, Agnes said, voice low and cautious, of doppelgangers, shadow selves that appear before death or disaster, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as curses. Seeing your own double is never a good omen. Daniel's unease grew. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and the more he searched for answers, the more elusive they became. One afternoon, while reviewing footage from a nearby security camera, he saw it, his own double, walking through town, silent and expressionless, a ghostly mirror of himself. Fear and determination surged together. Whoever or whatever this double was, it threatened not only his life, but the very fabric of his identity. Sheriff Mercer knew he had to act quickly, before the double erased him completely, and he became nothing more than the face in the morgue. The investigation had become a fight for survival, a battle against a shadow that reflected the darkest parts of himself. And the question remained, how do you fight something that looks exactly like you? Sheriff Daniel Mercer's world began to unravel as the eerie reality of his doppelganger settled in. The image of the man he'd seen in the morgue wasn't just a corpse, it was a reflection of himself, an unsettling double haunting the edges of his life. The concept of a doppelganger, once relegated to folklore and superstition, now pressed down on him like an unavoidable truth. Late one evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and shadows lengthened across Cedar Hollow, Daniel spotted movement near the edge of town. His heart raced as a figure stepped into the dim streetlight, a man who mirrored his own features perfectly, down to the smallest scar on his left cheek. The double's eyes were cold and unreadable, lacking the warmth and resolve Daniel recognized in his own reflection. The town's silence deepened as neighbors peered from windows. Unsettled by the uncanny presence, Daniel confronted the double, voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure's smile was thin and hollow. "I am what you fear, the shadow you cannot escape. I am the echo of your secrets, the harbinger of your end." Over the following days, sightings of the doppelganger increased. He appeared at the sheriff's office, standing silently in doorways or disappearing into the fog before anyone could approach. The reports surfaced of strange occurrences, lights flickering in empty rooms, whispers echoing down deserted streets, reflections that didn't match the person looking into the mirror. Daniel sought answers in the town's oldest archives, consulting Agnes Whitaker and Father Samuel Clark. They shared stories of doubles as omens of death or doom, manifestations that blurred the line between life and death, reality and illusion. One chilling tale spoke of a sheriff from generations past, whose doppelganger appeared before his mysterious disappearance. The townsfolk believed the double was a cursed shadow, a spirit sent to replace or claim the living. Daniel grappled with mounting fear and confusion. Was the figure trying to replace him, to take over his life? Or was it a warning, an embodiment of some deeper, darker truth? His nights grew restless. Sleep brought visions of standing before a mirror that fractured, his reflection splitting into countless versions, each darker and more twisted. He saw himself lying cold on the morgue slab, unable to move or speak. His grip on reality weakened as paranoia seeped in. He questioned every shadow, every stranger, every whispered conversation. Yet amid the turmoil, a fierce determination burned within him to reclaim his life, his identity, and his place in Cedar Hollow. He had to confront the doppelganger and whatever forces had summoned it. The boundary between man and shadow blurred, and Sheriff Daniel Mercer stood at the precipice, facing a foe as familiar as himself and as terrifying as death. The struggle for his soul and his very existence had only just begun. Sheriff Daniel Mercer's breath came heavy in the cold night air as he stood at the edge of the old mill, the place where the doppelganger had been spotted last. The shadows stretched long and twisted beneath the pale moonlight, and the air was thick with an unsettling silence. His flashlight trembled in his grip, but his eyes were fixed, unwavering. He had pieced together enough of the town's history and the legends of doubles to know what he faced wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was something ancient, something that threatened to erase him completely. Tonight, he would confront the shadow that had stolen his life. As he stepped forward, the darkness ahead coalesced into a figure, tall, silent, and unmistakably him. The doppelganger's eyes glowed faintly, cold and empty, devoid of humanity, but filled with an eerie awareness. "You've come," the double said, voice like a whispering wind, "but do you understand what you face?" Daniel swallowed the fear rising in his throat. "I understand enough to know I won't let you take my life." The figure smiled, a cruel, mirthless expression, and the world around them seemed to ripple and shift. The mill dissolved into a shifting maze of shadows and memories, each corridor lined with fragments of Daniel's past, victories, failures, regrets. "You carry your burdens like chains," the shadow whispered, "but I am the reflection of your doubts, your fears. To defeat me, you must confront yourself." Daniel felt the maze close in, shadows clawing at his clothes, pulling him toward forgotten mistakes and moments of weakness. The battle was no longer physical but a war of wills, a fight for his identity and soul, drawing strength from the love of his town and the people who believed in him. Daniel faced the darkest memories head-on. He accepted his flaws, forgave himself for past mistakes, and embraced the resolve that had always defined him. The shadow faltered, its form flickering as light pierced the darkness. Daniel stepped forward, raising the sheriff's badge, now found hidden beneath the mill's rotting floorboards. The emblem shimmered with a radiant glow, a beacon of his true self. "You belong to me," Daniel declared firmly. "This badge, this life, it's mine." The shadow screamed, a sound of rage and despair, before dissolving into a swirling mist. The maze vanished, replaced by the quiet night and the steady beat of his own heart. Exhausted but victorious, Daniel stood beneath the open sky, his shadow once again trailing faithfully behind him. The badge gleamed in the moonlight, a symbol not just of authority, but of survival and self-possession. He knew the battle was won, but the memory of the darkness would remain, a reminder of the fragile line between self and shadow. Sheriff Daniel Mercer had reclaimed himself, but he understood that identity is a constant fight, and some shadows never fully fade. Yet tonight, he was whole. Sheriff Daniel Mercer returned to Cedar Hollow with a heavy but resolute heart. The shadows that had haunted him, the eerie doppelganger, the vanished badge, and the absence of his own shadow were no longer specters looming over his existence. They had been confronted, battled, and for now driven back into the darkness. The town seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Word spread quickly of the sheriff's ordeal, and while some dismissed it as folklore or the product of stress, others regarded Daniel with renewed respect and a touch of awe. The man who had stared down a shadow of himself and emerged intact was more than just their protector. He had become a symbol of resilience. Yet, Daniel knew better than to believe the danger was gone forever. Shadows, after all, are persistent. They linger in the corners of the mind, and in the spaces where light falters. The experience had changed him, leaving a subtle scar that reminded him daily of the fragility of identity and the thin veil separating the known world from the unknown. In the weeks that followed, Daniel sought solace in the simple routines of his job, patrolling the streets, listening to the concerns of his neighbors, and standing as a steady presence in a town eager to move past its unease. But late at night, when the world grew quiet, he would catch a glimpse of his shadow lingering a little too long, or notice reflections that seemed to flicker with something other than light. He visited Agnes Whitaker and Father Samuel Clark, often sharing his thoughts and fears. Agnes reminded him that legends serve to warn and teach, that facing one's shadow is a test of courage and self-awareness. Father Clark offered prayers and counsel, grounding Daniel in faith and reminding him that even in darkness, there is always hope. One evening, standing outside the sheriff's office as twilight painted the sky in deep purples and golds, Daniel caught sight of his shadow stretching long and true beneath the street lamp. He smiled quietly to himself, a small but profound victory. He understood now that the badge he wore was more than a symbol of authority. It was a beacon of his will and his place in the world. The shadow at his feet was not just a shape cast by light. It was a reminder of the self he had reclaimed. The townspeople continued their lives, some still wary of the darkness that had brushed their town, others grateful for the sheriff who had faced it head-on. Stories of the doppelganger became part of Cedar Hollow's folklore, a cautionary tale whispered on cold nights and told to children to remind them that identity and courage are precious and fragile. Sheriff Daniel Mercer, however, remained vigilant. He knew that the mysteries of the world were never fully solved, and that shadows might return when least expected. But he was ready, steadfast, and unyielding, because the greatest battle was not against the shadow outside, but the one within. And tonight, as the stars shimmered overhead and the night breeze carried distant whispers, Daniel walked his town with his shadow by his side, whole and unbroken. The badge gleamed in the moonlight. He was home. The night air hung heavy over the small town of Ravenwood, a quiet place nestled among dense forests and winding rivers. Sheriff Mark Bennett sat in the dimly lit office of the county station, the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional crackle from the radio his only companions during the late shift. Most nights were uneventful, marked by routine calls and quiet patrols, but this night was about to shatter that fragile calm. Just past midnight, the sheriff's radio suddenly erupted in a burst of static. Mark's hand instinctively reached for the microphone as a faint, wavering voice filtered through the crackling interference. At first, the words were indecipherable, distorted, like a message slipping through time and space. Then the voice grew clearer, soft, urgent and haunting. "Help me, trapped, can't escape." Mark's brow furrowed. The voice was unlike any prank call or technical glitch he'd ever heard. It carried a desperation that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He clicked the microphone. "This is Sheriff Bennett. Where are you? Who's calling?" The radio responded with only static and faint whispers, but the eerie voice repeated, more insistent this time. "Darkness, waiting, find me." Deputy Harris, sitting nearby, leaned forward. "Sheriff, that's not normal. Could be interference from some old broadcast tower or a CB channel glitch." Mark shook his head, unease settling in his gut. "No, this feels different, like it's coming from somewhere close." The radio crackled again, and this time, the voice uttered a chilling phrase that froze Mark's blood. "The grave is not the end." The station fell silent, except for the fading static. Mark stared at the radio, heart pounding. Was it a ghost, a cry from beyond, or something else altogether? He grabbed his coat and radio, signaling the deputies, "I'm going out to check it out. Someone or something needs help." Outside, the town was cloaked in fog, the streetlights casting hazy pools of light on empty roads. Mark's cruiser rolled toward the outskirts where the radio signals seemed strongest. The old cemetery, abandoned for decades, but long whispered to be haunted. As he drove, the radio crackled sporadically, the voice weaving between faint pleas and unsettling warnings. Mark's hands tightened on the wheel, eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Arriving at the cemetery gate, he stepped out into the cold night, flashlight piercing the darkness. The silence pressed against him, broken only by distant rustling leaves and the faint hum of the radio playing that impossible voice. Mark took a deep breath and ventured inside, determined to uncover the source of the haunting message. Tonight, the sheriff would learn that some calls come from places beyond this world, and some voices never truly rest. Sheriff Mark Bennett's footsteps crunched softly against the frost-hardened earth as he moved deeper into the shadowed cemetery. His flashlight sliced through the thick mist that clung to the ancient headstones, casting long wavering beams that danced across cracked marble and moss-covered crosses. The eerie voice that had come through his radio earlier still echoed faintly in his ears, urgent, pleading, and impossible to ignore. He scanned the graves, searching for any sign of disturbance. Most markers were worn and weathered, names barely legible after decades of exposure to wind and rain. Yet here and there, fresh footprints pressed into the dirt, as if someone or something had passed recently. Mark knelt by a grave near the center of the cemetery, noting disturbed soil and a faint shimmer in the air above it. The radio in his hand crackled, and the ghostly voice whispered again, "Find the truth, free us." The sheriff's pulse quickened. This was no ordinary haunting. The voice seemed tied to something unresolved, a tragedy or secret buried beneath the earth. He moved cautiously toward an old mausoleum, its iron gate hanging crooked, swinging with a slow creak in the cold breeze. The radio's static intensified as he approached, the voice overlapping with unsettling noises, soft sobs, distant footsteps, a faint chorus of whispered prayers. Inside the mausoleum, the air was colder, heavy, with the scent of decay and forgotten memories. Mark's flashlight beam revealed rows of stone coffins, each etched with names and dates. One coffin lay slightly ajar, its lid shifted as if disturbed by unseen hands. As he reached out to examine it, a sudden chill swept through the chamber, and the radio emitted a sharp burst of static before falling silent. The oppressive silence that followed was broken only by Mark's own steady breathing. Then a faint light flickered at the far end of the mausoleum, ethereal and shifting. Mark's heart pounded as the light coalesced into a translucent figure of a woman, her eyes filled with sorrow and longing. "Help us," she whispered, voice echoing through the cold stone. Trapped, bound by lies, Mark swallowed hard, struggling to steady his nerves. "Who are you? What happened here?" The apparition's gaze drifted toward the open coffin. "Injustice, betrayal, silence. We cannot rest until the truth is known." Suddenly, the heavy gate slammed shut behind him, and the radio crackled back to life with the voice repeating, "The grave is not the end." Panic surged, but Mark forced himself to remain calm. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, shadows shifting like living things. He realized the radio was more than a communication device. It was a bridge between worlds, carrying the messages of those who could not find peace. With renewed determination, Sheriff Bennett vowed to uncover the secrets buried in Ravenwood's past, to bring light to the darkness that haunted the dead. But as the night deepened and the voices grew louder, he understood that the path ahead was fraught with danger, both seen and unseen, and that some calls from beyond the grave demanded a price far greater than he had imagined. Sheriff Mark Bennett sat late into the night at his cluttered desk, the flickering glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across old town records and brittle newspapers. The eerie voice from the morgue still echoed in his mind, haunting and insistent, determined to uncover the truth behind the spectral calls. He delved into the history of the abandoned cemetery and the nearby mausoleum. The town archives revealed a dark chapter long buried beneath the surface of Cedar Hollow's peaceful facade. Decades ago, a tragic event had unfolded, a fire that consumed part of the town, claiming lives and leaving scars on the community. Among the victims were several prominent townsfolk whose deaths were never fully explained. Rumors whispered of a cover-up, secrets buried alongside the victims in unmarked graves. Mark sought out Agnes Whitaker, the town's historian and keeper of forgotten stories. In her dimly lit parlor, surrounded by dusty tomes and faded photographs, Agnes spoke in hushed tones. "The souls trapped in that cemetery are restless," she explained. "They've been crying out for justice, for their stories to be heard. The radio, the sheriff's radio, has somehow become their voice, their link to the living." The weight of Agnes's words settled on Mark's shoulders. These weren't random hauntings, but desperate attempts to communicate, to warn, to seek closure. As days passed, the paranormal activity intensified. The radio would burst to life unexpectedly, broadcasting fragments of conversations from the past, cries for help, whispered names, pleas for forgiveness. Shadows flickered at the edge of Mark's vision, and cold spots followed him like invisible chains. One night, as the sheriff revisited the mausoleum, he felt a presence guiding him. The air was thick with sorrow and urgency. Inside, he discovered hidden journals belonging to a local priest who had witnessed the tragedy firsthand. The priest's writings detailed attempts to conceal the truth, names erased, evidence destroyed, and a curse invoked to silence the victims forever. Overwhelmed but resolute, Mark realized he was entangled in a battle between the living and the dead, between truth and silence. He shared his findings with Father Samuel Clark, who agreed to assist in bringing peace to the restless spirits. Together, they prepared a ritual, combining prayer and remembrance, to honor the dead and break the chains that bound them. But the closer Mark came to unveiling the truth, the more dangerous the encounters became. One evening, the radio crackled with a voice clearer than ever before, warning of forces determined to keep the past buried. Sheriff Bennett faced not only supernatural forces, but the lingering shadows of human deceit and fear. The voice from beyond the grave was no longer a distant whisper, it was a call to action, and Mark knew he could no longer turn away. His town's peace, and perhaps his own soul, depended on what he did next. Sheriff Mark Bennett stood at the edge of the ancient cemetery, the cold night air biting through his coat. Beside him, Father Samuel Clark held a small wooden cross, his face solemn as he prepared for the ritual that might finally bring peace to the restless spirits haunting Cedar Hollow. The radio in Mark's hand crackled faintly, as if the voices from beyond were listening, waiting. The two men stepped into the heart of the cemetery, where weathered gravestones leaned at odd angles, and the ground was disturbed by time and sorrow. Father Clark began to chant prayers in a steady rhythmic cadence, his voice rising above the whispering wind. Mark repeated words learned from old texts and Agnes's teachings, invoking blessings and forgiveness. As the ritual progressed, the radio suddenly burst to life. The haunting voice was clearer than ever, a desperate plea, mixed with sorrow and relief. "Thank you, truth, free us." Shadows shifted among the tombstones, flickering with ethereal light. The air grew charged with energy, and the earth beneath their feet seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Mark felt a cold hand brush his shoulder, sending a shiver down his spine, but he did not flinch. Suddenly, the ground near the mausoleum trembled. A faint glow emerged from beneath the cracked stone floor, illuminating hidden inscriptions that spoke of betrayal, sacrifice, and a binding curse placed to silence the victims. Father Clark's voice grew louder, calling upon divine mercy to break the chains of injustice. The spectral figures of those lost began to appear, faces twisted in anguish slowly softening into peaceful expressions. The whispers transformed into songs, a choir of voices lifted in gratitude. The oppressive weight that had hung over the cemetery for decades lifted like a fading fog. But the ritual was not without resistance. A chilling howl tore through the night, and dark shapes lunged from the shadows, manifestations of the curse's lingering power. Mark and Father Clark stood firm, their combined strength pushing back the darkness, their faith and courage a shield against despair. After what felt like an eternity, silence returned. The radio fell quiet, its static replaced by a calm stillness. The air felt lighter, warmer, and the cemetery no longer exuded menace but solemn reverence. Exhausted but victorious, Mark knew the spirits were finally at rest, their stories told and their souls freed. Yet, he understood that the scars of the past ran deep, and the echoes of history would continue to remind the living of the fragile boundary between life and death. As dawn broke, the sheriff and the priest left the cemetery behind, their hearts heavy with both sorrow and hope. The radio lay silent, but its voice had spoken volumes. Truth had pierced the veil, and peace was won. But in the quiet moments before morning, a faint whisper lingered on the wind, reminding Mark that some mysteries never truly end, and some voices from beyond the grave will always wait to be heard. The morning sun cast pale light over Cedar Hollow, bathing the town in a quiet glow that belied the weight of the night's events. Sheriff Mark Bennett stood at the threshold of his office, watching as townsfolk moved about their daily routines, children playing in the schoolyard, shopkeepers opening their doors, neighbors exchanging greetings. Life had resumed its familiar rhythm, yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The radio sat silently on his desk, its static replaced by stillness. The voices from beyond the grave had finally faded, their messages delivered, and their unrest soothed. Mark felt a complex mix of relief and solemnity. The night's ritual had lifted a darkness long entwined with the town's history, but the scars remained etched in memory and stone. News of the sheriff's confrontation with the supernatural spread through Cedar Hollow, weaving into the fabric of local lore. Some dismissed it as ghost stories or collective imagination, while others regarded it as a profound reminder of the fragile boundary between the living and the dead. At the diner, whispers of the radio ghost became common talk. Visitors asked cautious questions, elders shared their own tales of restless spirits and unresolved grief. The cemetery, once shunned and feared, slowly transformed into a place of remembrance and respect. The community began holding annual vigils, honoring those who had been silenced by time and secrecy. Sheriff Bennett found himself reflecting deeply on the experience. The line between fact and faith, seen and unseen, had blurred in ways he had never anticipated. The encounter had tested his beliefs and expanded his understanding of the mysteries that dwell just beyond human comprehension. He continued his work with renewed purpose, aware that his role extended beyond enforcing laws. It was about safeguarding a community's spirit, history, and hope. The badge he wore now felt heavier with responsibility, not just for the living, but for the voices of the past. One evening, as Mark locked up the station, a soft breeze stirred the leaves outside. He glanced at the radio, half expecting it to crackle again, but it remained still. A fleeting shadow crossed the window, perhaps a trick of the light, or something more. He smiled quietly to himself, accepting that some questions may never be fully answered, and some presences may always linger just out of sight. Sheriff Mark Bennett understood that true courage lay in facing the unknown, with an open heart and steadfast resolve. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, the town of Cedar Hollow settled into peaceful slumber, held gently between the worlds, watched over by those who listened to the voices from beyond the grave. The night had spoken, and its stories would never be forgotten. Sheriff Tom Lawson had walked the creaking floors of Mill Creek's old jailhouse countless times over the years. The building stood at the heart of the town, weathered brick and rusted iron bars, telling stories of past crimes, confessions, and quiet desperation. To most, it was just a relic, a place to lock up troublemakers for a night or two before they faced the law. But to Tom, it was a solemn responsibility, a duty to keep order in a place where tempers ran high and secrets often stayed locked behind cold steel. That night, as the moon hung low and clouds obscured the stars, Tom completed his usual rounds. The last prisoner, a drifter caught wandering too close to the train tracks, was booked and secured in his cell. Tom double-checked the locks, listening for the reassuring click of the heavy iron door fastening shut. Satisfied, he nodded to Deputy Harris. "That's the last one for tonight. We're locked up tight." The deputy grinned, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Nothing's getting in or out till morning." Tom made his way toward the main door, keys jingling softly at his belt. The jail was silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere deep in the walls. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. As Tom reached the exit, a sudden sound froze him in his tracks, footsteps echoing from the upper tier of the jail cells, slow, deliberate, steady. But the door to the cell block was locked tight, and every prisoner's whereabouts had been accounted for. He paused, listening intently. The footsteps continued, growing slightly louder, then fading into the distance. His heart thudded in his chest, not from fear, but from the impossible. No one should be walking inside the jail beyond the prisoners and staff, and yet there was undeniably someone pacing the corridors. Tom's gaze swept the dim hallway, shadows stretching like fingers across the peeling paint. He called out, voice firm but cautious, "Hello, who's there?" Only silence answered. He moved cautiously back toward the cell block, hand hovering near his holstered sidearm. The footsteps resumed, closer now, circling the corner, just out of sight. Tom rounded the corner sharply, flashlight cutting a path through the gloom. The cell doors glistened coldly in the beam, their bars casting long shadows on the floor. Each cell was occupied, or accounted for, yet the footsteps continued, now echoing from the empty hallway beyond the last cell. A chill ran down Tom's spine as he realized the sound was coming from a place no living person should be. He checked the security logs and found no sign of any unauthorized entry. The surveillance cameras showed static at odd moments, but no figure matching the footsteps. Tom's voice shook slightly as he spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, I'm hearing footsteps inside the jail. I'm checking it out." "Copy, Sheriff," came the calm reply. "Backup is en route." But even as he waited, the footsteps faded into a haunting silence, leaving Tom alone with the heavy, unnatural quiet. As he stood in the corridor, Sheriff Lawson knew one thing: the night had only just begun, and the prison held secrets far darker than any criminal locked behind its doors. Sheriff Tom Lawson's flashlight beam cut through the thick shadows of the jail's upper corridor, but it did little to ease the growing tension coiling in his chest. The footsteps he had heard moments ago weren't imagined. They echoed through the cold stone halls, slow and deliberate, yet no one was visible. He carefully checked each cell as he walked, shining his light through the heavy iron bars. The prisoners were all there, some asleep, others murmuring quietly in their bunks, but none moving about. He called out again, his voice firm, "If someone's here who shouldn't be, make yourself known." Only silence answered, thick and suffocating. Tom moved toward the back wing, where the oldest cells stood, long sealed off and unused, sealed behind rusted gates and dust-covered locks. He reached the heavy iron door and tried the handle, locked tight, yet from beyond it came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft, dragging, pacing. His breath caught. He radioed dispatch quietly. "I'm at the old wing. There's definitely something here. Backup is 5 minutes out." "Sheriff," came the calm reply. Tom's flashlight flickered, and a sudden cold gust swept down the hallway, extinguishing his light for a split second. In the brief darkness, he heard a whispered sigh, barely audible, yet chilling. His hand shot to his belt, gripping the flashlight tightly as the light blazed back on. The corridor was empty, except for the faint outline of a shadow slipping behind the barred gates. Heart pounding, Tom peered through the bars. The cells beyond were coated in dust and cobwebs, untouched for years. Nothing should be alive here. Yet the footsteps continued, circling, pacing with slow inevitability. He called Deputy Harris over when she arrived, moments later, flashlight in hand. Together, they inspected the sealed cells, searching for any hidden entrances or signs of recent activity. But the floor was pristine, no footprints or disturbance. The silence returned, like a suffocating blanket. Suddenly, from deep within the prison walls, a low moan resonated, a sorrowful, haunting sound that seemed to seep from the very stones. Tom's skin prickled. "That's no animal," he whispered. The moan grew louder, joined by the soft clinking of chains and the scrape of unseen footsteps. Deputy Harris swallowed nervously. "Sheriff, maybe we should wait for backup." But Tom shook his head, determination hardening his voice. "No, we need to find out what's here." They set up surveillance cameras and motion sensors, hoping to catch any movement. The cameras flickered and sometimes showed static, but no clear images appeared. As the hours ticked by, strange noises plagued the jail. Doors creaked open and slammed shut on their own. Cold drafts swept through locked rooms, and faint whispers echoed down empty corridors. Tom sat at his desk, eyes scanning the monitors, tension knotting his muscles. The footsteps returned intermittently, pacing relentlessly, a ghostly rhythm echoing in the night. He began to question the stories he'd heard from older deputies, tales of prisoners who vanished without a trace, of guards driven mad by voices and shadows, and of a restless spirit bound to the jail. Skepticism warred with fear, but the evidence, the sounds, the flickering lights, the unexplainable phenomena could not be ignored. Sheriff Lawson understood he was facing something beyond the ordinary, something anchored in the prison's dark past, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Sheriff Tom Lawson sat in his office, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders as he pored over dusty town records and faded newspaper clippings. The haunting footsteps and eerie noises within the jail had shaken even his steadfast resolve. Determined to understand what plagued the old prison, he delved into its history, searching for clues that might explain the restless presence. He discovered that the jail was one of the oldest buildings in Mill Creek, dating back over a century. Its walls had witnessed countless stories, some of justice served, others of injustice and tragedy. Several prisoners had died mysteriously over the years, some after harsh sentences, others under suspicious circumstances. Rumors whispered of a dark past, of executions carried out in secret, and prisoners who vanished without explanation. Tom spoke with Agnes Whitaker, the town's historian, who shared chilling tales passed down through generations. "The jail has long been said to harbor restless souls," she explained, her voice low and solemn. "Those who suffered within its walls sometimes leave a mark, footsteps, whispers, signs that they are still here." As Tom absorbed these stories, he realized the footsteps he'd heard might not be a trick of the mind, or mechanical noises, but echoes of tormented spirits trapped in the prison's shadow. The sheriff's skepticism wavered as the supernatural occurrences intensified. One night, he witnessed a flickering shadow darting along the corridor, too swift to be human, but too deliberate to be random. Doors slammed shut without cause, and the cold spots grew colder, chilling him to the bone. Psychological strain took hold. Sleep eluded him as visions of anguished faces and desperate cries invaded his dreams. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. Deputies reported strange sensations, cold touches on their shoulders, murmurs in empty cells, fleeting glimpses of figures in the dark. Fear seeped into the ranks, threatening to unravel the jail's order. Tom grappled with disbelief and growing dread. Was the prison cursed? Were the stories true? Or was his mind playing tricks under stress? Despite the fear, his determination only strengthened. He owed it to the town, to the living and the dead, to uncover the truth behind the footsteps that haunted the jail. He prepared to confront the restless presence, to shine light into the darkness, and bring peace to those long forgotten. But as the footsteps echoed once more down the empty halls, Tom knew that the battle would test not just his courage, but his very soul. Sheriff Tom Lawson stood firm beneath the dim glow of the flickering fluorescent lights in the jail's main corridor, the atmosphere thick with a tension that was almost suffocating. Tonight he wasn't alone. Deputy Harris, his most trusted aide, stood beside him, clutching her flashlight and peering cautiously down the shadowed halls. They had set up cameras, motion sensors, and even placed recording devices in the cells and corridors, hoping to capture any evidence of the strange phenomena that had plagued the jail. The footsteps returned as if summoned by their presence, soft, measured, pacing steadily down the hallway, yet no figure appeared in the narrow beam of their flashlights or on any of the monitors. Suddenly the temperature dropped sharply, their breaths visible in the frigid air. A low, mournful moan echoed through the prison walls, reverberating in their chests. Harris swallowed hard, whispering, "Sheriff, this isn't natural." Tom nodded, swallowing his own fear. "We need to face this head on." They pressed onward, moving deeper into the oldest part of the jail, where the walls were thickest and the air heaviest with history. At the end of the corridor, the unmistakable sound of chains dragging echoed faintly, accompanied by a cold wind that seemed to come from nowhere. Suddenly, a shadow shifted at the corner of Tom's vision, an indistinct figure, flickering in and out of sight. The air grew heavy with sorrow and anger. "Show yourself," Tom commanded, voice steady though his heart pounded fiercely. The figure coalesced into a translucent man, his face twisted with pain and regret. "I am Thomas Reed," the apparition whispered, "once a prisoner here, falsely condemned and forgotten." Tom's jaw tightened. "Why do you linger?" "My voice was silenced," Reed said. "Justice denied. I am bound to these walls until the truth is known." The ghost's presence intensified, the shadows around them deepening, objects rattling on shelves, and the faint sound of whispered pleas filling the air. Tom and Harris exchanged a determined glance. They couldn't turn back now. Together, they searched the old records and hidden compartments in the jailhouse, uncovering evidence of Reed's wrongful conviction, a crime covered up by those in power decades ago. As the truth emerged, Tom read aloud the forgotten testimonies, breaking the silence that had shackled Reed's spirit. The apparition's anguished expression softened, and with a final grateful nod, Thomas Reed vanished into a soft glow that dissipated into the air. The footsteps ceased. The jail's oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a quiet peace. Sheriff Lawson and Deputy Harris stood in the empty corridor, breathless but victorious. They had faced the darkness within the jail walls and brought light to a forgotten injustice. But as Tom locked the prison door one last time that night, a faint echo of footsteps lingered, a subtle reminder that some shadows never fully fade, and some stories demand to be heard, no matter how long they remain in the dark. Sheriff Tom Lawson sat at his desk the following morning, the pale light of dawn filtering through the barred windows of the jailhouse. The heavy weight that had pressed on him for weeks, the eerie footsteps, the chilling presence, the ghostly visitation, had finally lifted. The corridor was quiet now, its oppressive atmosphere replaced by a calm that felt almost sacred. The townsfolk had gathered at the courthouse square, where Tom shared the story of Thomas Reed, the prisoner wronged, forgotten, and bound to the jail until justice was served. The crowd listened with a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and gratitude. For many, it was a reckoning with the past, a healing of old wounds that had festered in silence for decades. Mill Creek's elders spoke of the power of acknowledgement, how facing history, even its darkest parts, could restore balance. The sheriff's efforts had not only freed a restless spirit, but had rekindled the town's collective conscience. In the days that followed, the jailhouse became a place of remembrance rather than fear. A small plaque was installed near the old cell block, honoring those who had suffered within its walls, and those who sought truth and justice. Visitors left flowers and notes, and for the first time in generations, the jail's shadows felt less like chains and more like stories remembered. Sheriff Lawson found himself changed. The experience had deepened his understanding of his role, not just as an enforcer of law, but as a guardian of history, memory, and the unseen threads that bind a community together. Late at night, he often sat alone in the jail's quiet corridors, reflecting on the fragile boundary between the living and the dead. Sometimes, a soft breeze would stir the air, carrying faint echoes of whispered thanks, or the distant clinking of spectral chains. He no longer feared these moments, but embraced them as reminders of the lives woven into the fabric of Mill Creek. His deputies noticed a newfound solemnity in the sheriff's demeanor, a quiet respect for the mysteries beyond sight. They, too, learned to listen, not just to the sounds of the living, but to the silent voices of the past. Though the footsteps had ceased, and the spirit of Thomas Reed had found peace, Tom knew the jail would always hold secrets, echoes of pain and courage, sorrow and hope. And as the sun set over the town, casting long shadows across the worn bricks and iron bars, Sheriff Tom Lawson stood watchful and unwavering. For in the end, some doors remain open, not to haunt, but to remind, and some footsteps, though silent now, continue to guide those willing to listen. Sheriff Daniel Moore had been overseeing the small-town jail of Willow Creek for over a decade, a place worn by time and history. The building creaked with age, its stone walls weathered, and wooden floorboards groaning beneath each step. Though the jail hadn't seen many inmates in recent years, it still held an air of somber quietness, as if the walls remembered every whispered secret and anguished cry. One rainy afternoon, during a routine inspection to check for repairs, Daniel found himself drawn to a neglected corner of the jail's basement, a place rarely visited. Behind a loose panel in the wall, hidden beneath years of dust and cobwebs, he discovered an old, leather-bound diary. Its edges were frayed, pages yellowed and brittle, but the diary seemed strangely preserved. Curious, Daniel carefully opened it, revealing neat, flowing handwriting that immediately drew him in. The entries began with vivid descriptions of daily life inside the jail from decades ago, written by someone who identified themselves only as J. As he read, the sheriff was pulled into the haunting world of the diary's author, a prisoner trapped not only by iron bars, but by despair and injustice. The entries spoke of cold nights spent alone, the harshness of the guards, and the fading hope for freedom or redemption. But it was the unusual tone of the later writings that unsettled Daniel most. The author wrote about strange noises echoing through the corridors, shadows moving where no one should be, and whispers that seemed to call his name in the dead of night. "I am not alone here," one entry read. "There are eyes watching, waiting." Daniel felt a chill as he flipped through the pages, sensing a presence beyond the written words. The diary wasn't just a record of the past. It seemed alive with emotion, fear, and a desperate plea for someone to listen. That night, Daniel took the diary home, unable to tear himself away from the story, unfolding within its fragile pages. He wondered who Jay was, what had become of him, and whether the ghostly hints in the writing were more than imagination. As he read deeper, the lines between history and haunting began to blur. Daniel's own nights grew restless, filled with uneasy dreams, and the feeling that the prisoner's story was reaching out, seeking justice beyond the grave. And so began the sheriff's journey, not just to solve a mystery, but to give a voice to a ghost trapped in the shadows of the jailhouse. Sheriff Daniel Moore found himself drawn deeper into the diary's haunting narrative. Night after night, he pored over the fragile pages, tracing the emotional journey of Jay, a prisoner whose words revealed a life of hardship and growing despair. The entries described long, lonely hours behind bars, the biting cold of the cell, and the fading hope of justice. But more than that, the diary chronicled strange happenings, footsteps echoing when no one was there, distant voices whispering through the corridors, and shadowy figures glimpsed from the corner of the eye. The prisoner wrote of restless spirits trapped alongside him, their suffering etched into the very stones of the jail. Daniel began to notice unsettling parallels between the diary's accounts and the recent odd occurrences in the jailhouse, the unexplained noises, flickering lights, and the persistent feeling of being watched. The past was bleeding into the present. One entry caught his attention. "Tonight, I heard my name called softly, a voice from the darkness. I am not alone. They watch, they wait." The sense of isolation and fear was palpable, as if Jay was reaching out across time, hoping for recognition. As Daniel delved into the history of the jail, he learned that Jay was likely Jacob Thornton, a man convicted nearly a century ago, under dubious circumstances. Local whispers suggested Thornton was innocent, framed by corrupt officials who wanted to silence him. His fate remained a mystery, his name fading from official records. Strange things began to happen around Daniel. At night, footsteps paced the hallways, matching the rhythm described in the diary. Doors creaked open and shut without cause. Shadows flickered just beyond his vision, and cold spots chilled the air. Unexpectedly, one evening, while alone in the jail office, Daniel felt a sudden presence behind him. Turning quickly, he saw nothing but sensed a sorrowful energy lingering in the room. The radio on his desk crackled with static before whispering faintly, "Remember me." The psychological strain weighed heavily. Daniel struggled to maintain his composure as the supernatural seemed to weave through his life, blurring the line between reality and the spectral. Driven by a mix of fear and duty, he began using the diary as a bridge, speaking aloud to the spirit, hoping to communicate. "Jacob," he said softly one night, "I hear you. Tell me what you need." The silence that followed was thick, but then a chill breeze swept through the room, carrying with it a faint whisper, "Justice, truth." Daniel realized the diary was more than words on paper. It was a vessel for a restless soul seeking peace. With each page turned and each whispered response, the ghost's presence grew stronger, demanding that Daniel uncover the hidden truths buried within the jail's dark history. And so, the sheriff found himself entwined in a spectral mystery, one where the past haunted the present, and a diary written by a ghost held the key to unlocking a long-forgotten injustice. Sheriff Daniel Moore couldn't shake the feeling that the jail itself was alive, watching, waiting, and whispering secrets only he could hear. Each night, as he continued reading Jacob Thornton's diary, the supernatural signs intensified. Doors creaked open on their own, cold drafts slithered through the corridors, and flickering shadows seemed to flicker just beyond his flashlight's beam. One evening, while inspecting the old cell block alone, Daniel paused, as a faint whisper brushed past his ear. He spun around, flashlight darting wildly, but found only empty cells and peeling paint. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a translucent figure, barely visible, standing motionless against the wall. The apparition's hollow eyes met his for a heartbeat before fading into the darkness. Daniel's breath hitched. It was Jacob Thornton, no longer just words on pages, but a restless presence reaching out. Determined to learn more, Daniel began, leaving the diary open in the jail's common area, reading aloud passages at night, in hopes of eliciting a response. The air grew thick with tension, and strange occurrences multiplied. Soft footsteps echoed in empty halls, objects shifted slightly when unobserved, and a low moan rose and fell like the wail of forgotten pain. The sheriff enlisted the help of Father Samuel Clark, whose knowledge of spiritual matters offered guidance and comfort. Together, they attempted to communicate with Jacob's spirit through the diary, praying and asking for the truth behind his torment. One chilling night, the radio on Daniel's desk crackled to life unexpectedly. Through the static, a faint voice whispered, "Find the truth, free me." The plea was unmistakable. Daniel's resolve hardened. He realized that Jacob's spirit was bound not just by death, but by injustice. His story untold, his name erased, and his soul trapped within the jail's walls. Piecing together historical records and testimonies, Daniel uncovered signs of a wrongful conviction, tampered evidence, coerced witnesses, and a corrupt system eager to bury the truth. The diary's cryptic references now made sense. Jacob's spirit sought justice, not vengeance. The jail's atmosphere grew heavier as the burden of the past pressed on Daniel. He felt the weight of countless forgotten souls lingering in the shadows, their pain woven into the very fabric of the building. Despite growing fear and exhaustion, Daniel remained steadfast. The diary was his guide, the voice of a ghost, his call to action. He prepared to confront the darkness lurking in the jail's history, to shine a light on the truth, and give Jacob Thornton the peace he deserved. But the road ahead was fraught with danger, both earthly and supernatural, and as the footsteps echoed once more through the empty halls, Daniel knew the jail's restless spirits were watching, waiting to see if justice would finally be served. Sheriff Daniel Moore stood in the dimly lit corridor of the old jail, the diary of Jacob Thornton clutched tightly in his hands. The air was thick with anticipation, and something darker. Father Samuel Clark stood beside him, holding a small crucifix, his voice low as he recited prayers meant to soothe restless souls. The time had come to confront the past and the spirit that haunted these walls. Daniel had uncovered damning evidence, forged testimonies, suppressed evidence, and a miscarriage of justice that had condemned Jacob Thornton to a wrongful death. The diary was more than a record. It was a testament to a life stolen and a soul denied peace. As they moved through the jailhouse, shadows seemed to lengthen and pulse with unseen energy. The walls whispered secrets, and the faint sound of chains dragging echoed faintly, as if carried on a spectral breeze. Suddenly, a cold gust swept through the hallway, extinguishing their lanterns. In the darkness, a pale figure materialized, a translucent man with eyes full of sorrow and anger. "I am bound here," the spirit spoke, voice echoing with centuries of pain. "Until the truth is spoken, until my name is cleared." Daniel steadied his voice. "Jacob Thornton, we know your story now. We will make sure justice is done." The apparition's face softened, but the jail trembled as unseen forces resisted. Doors slammed violently, and shadows twisted into grotesque shapes. The battle was not just spiritual but psychological, the fight between denial and acceptance, between silence and truth. Father Clark's prayers grew louder, weaving through the chaos, a lifeline against the darkness. Daniel opened the diary and read aloud the final entries, words of hope, despair, and a plea for remembrance. As the last words echoed, a blinding light filled the corridor. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a serene calm. The ghostly figure smiled one last time before dissolving into a cascade of shimmering light. The jail was silent once more, but Daniel knew the victory was fragile. The truth had been revealed, but healing would take time. He vowed to honor Jacob Thornton's memory, not just with words, but by ensuring the town remembered the lessons of justice and compassion. The diary, once a conduit of pain, was now a bridge to peace. As Daniel and Father Clark exited the jailhouse, the dawn broke, casting warm light on the worn bricks, and though shadows still lingered at the edges, the heart of the jail beat steady once more, guarded by those who dared to face the ghosts of the past. Sheriff Daniel Moore returned to his office as the morning light filtered softly through the barred windows of the old jailhouse. The heavy silence that had enveloped the building for years now felt lighter, as though a long-standing weight had finally been lifted. The diary of Jacob Thornton, once hidden and forgotten, sat on Daniel's desk, a testament to a story finally brought into the light. The town of Willow Creek was slowly awakening to a new chapter in its history. News of the sheriff's discovery and the spirit's restless plea had spread quietly but surely. Some townsfolk whispered in hushed tones about the haunting, while others viewed it as a profound reminder of justice delayed and lives impacted. At the local community center, a small memorial was organized. Families connected to the forgotten prisoners, descendants of those long gone, gathered to honor their memories. Flowers were laid near the jail, and a plaque was unveiled, commemorating the lives and stories unearthed by the sheriff's perseverance. Daniel stood among the crowd, feeling the weight of his responsibility deepen. He understood that his role extended beyond enforcing the law. It was about protecting the dignity and history of the community, giving voice to those silenced by time and circumstance. The diary was carefully preserved, its pages digitized, and shared with local schools and historians. It became a symbol not only of a wrongful conviction, but of the power of remembrance and truth. Yet even as peace settled over the jailhouse, Daniel knew the echoes of the past would never fully fade. The building itself seemed to hold the imprints of countless souls, some who had found rest, others still whispering in the shadows. Late at night, when the town slept, Daniel sometimes heard a soft rustling or a faint sigh carried on the wind. He no longer feared these moments. Instead, he embraced them as reminders of the delicate boundary between the living and the dead. His deputies noticed a quiet change in the sheriff, a deeper empathy, a thoughtful gaze that lingered on the old walls as if listening to the stories hidden within. The town moved forward, but the lessons learned remained etched in its heart. And though the diary's last page was turned, the spirit of Jacob Thornton lived on, injustice confronted, silence broken, and a community forever changed. Sheriff Daniel Moore stood vigilant, guardian not only of law, but of memory, ready to face whatever shadows might rise in the future. Because some stories do not end in silence, they echo through time, carried on the whispers of those who refuse to be forgotten. Sheriff Daniel Collins was no stranger to the strange undercurrents that sometimes rippled beneath the surface of his small town. Millfield had its share of unsolved mysteries and whispered legends, but nothing had prepared him for the night the evidence locker screamed. It started as an ordinary evening. The sheriff's office hummed with the low murmur of radios and the occasional clatter of files being shuffled. Daniel was going through the day's paperwork when a call came in requesting a specific piece of evidence from a long-closed case, an item crucial to reopening a decades-old investigation. The evidence locker, a steel vault tucked away in the back of the station, was where everything was kept secure. Daniel grabbed the heavy set of keys from his desk, knowing the locker's door was old and stubborn but reliable. He made his way through the dim corridors, past the worn bulletin boards plastered with missing person flyers and mugshots, to the evidence room. The air grew cooler, the scent of dust and mildew thick around him. As he inserted the key into the lock, a sudden chill ran down his spine, but he dismissed it as nerves. The lock clicked open, and with a creak, the massive door swung ajar. Then came the scream. It wasn't human, not quite. It was a raw, guttural howl that tore through the silence and rattled the walls of the station. Daniel stumbled backward, heart hammering in his chest. The officers nearby froze, eyes wide with shock, hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. What the hell was that? Deputy Harris shouted, rushing to his side. Daniel swallowed hard, steadying himself. It came from inside the locker. The room was suffused with a heavy, oppressive energy. Papers fluttered without wind, and shadows seemed to twist and lengthen along the walls. The evidence bags and boxes inside the locker rattled violently, as if caught in an invisible storm. The sheriff and deputies exchanged uneasy glances. No one could explain the scream, or the sudden surge of supernatural force. Determined to regain control, Daniel stepped cautiously into the locker, flashlight cutting through the gloom. Rows of evidence bags lined the shelves, mementos of crimes past and present. But something else caught his eye. A small, unmarked wooden box nestled in the corner, untouched and strangely out of place. As he reached for the box, a cold wave surged through the room, and the scream echoed again, piercing, anguished and desperate. Daniel's hand trembled, but he knew this wasn't a prank or a mechanical malfunction. The evidence locker held secrets far darker than anyone had imagined, and the night was just beginning. Sheriff Daniel Collins stared at the unmarked wooden box, nestled in the corner of the evidence locker, its dark surface worn but unblemished by dust or time. Unlike the neatly sealed plastic bags and labeled containers surrounding it, this box seemed almost alive, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. The oppressive energy in the room thickened, pressing against Daniel's chest with every breath. He exchanged uneasy glances with Deputy Harris, who stood rigid, her flashlight beam trembling slightly as it swept over the locker's contents. "Should we open it?" Harris asked, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated. The scream from moments ago still echoed in his ears, raw and filled with anguish. But the sheriff knew that if there was something trapped inside that box, ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. With a steadying breath, Daniel reached out and lifted the box from its resting place. It was surprisingly light, but as soon as he held it, the air around them seemed to hum, a low vibration that raised goosebumps on his arms. Setting the box on a nearby table, Daniel carefully inspected its surface. There were no markings or inscriptions, just the grain of old wood, smooth to the touch, but carrying an unsettling aura. As he slowly eased the lid open, a piercing wail erupted from the box, flooding the evidence room with an otherworldly scream. The lights flickered violently, and several officers jumped back, covering their ears against the agonizing sound. Inside the box lay a faded blood-stained scarf, and a bundle of brittle papers tied with a frayed ribbon. The scarf smelled faintly of decay, and the papers crumbled slightly as Daniel lifted them. Curious despite the dread rising in his chest, he began to read the letters, fragments of desperate pleas, confessions, and warnings from a victim long gone. The handwriting was erratic, filled with fear and sorrow, speaking of betrayal, violence, and an unrelenting curse tied to the evidence. Suddenly, the lights in the room dimmed further, shadows lengthening unnaturally. Objects on nearby shelves rattled, and the temperature dropped sharply. Daniel's breath steamed in the cold air. A faint whisper drifted through the room, barely audible, but unmistakably real. "Remember me, free me." The sheriff's heart pounded. The box was more than a container. It was a vessel for pain and injustice, a link to a restless spirit, demanding recognition. As the night wore on, the paranormal disturbances intensified. Phones rang with no caller, radios crackled with static and distorted voices, and shadowy figures flickered, just beyond sight. Daniel realized the box was connected to an unsolved crime, perhaps the original source of the haunting, a victim whose story had been buried and forgotten. The evidence locker, once a symbol of order and closure, had become a gateway to a dark past, refusing to be silenced. Sheriff Collins knew he faced a dangerous mystery, one where the boundary between the living and the dead was terrifyingly thin. And the screaming was only the beginning. Sheriff Daniel Collins sat late into the night, surrounded by yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, and brittle court documents spread across his desk. The unmarked box from the evidence locker had thrown open a door to a past long buried beneath the surface of Millfield's quiet streets, a past marred by pain, betrayal, and secrets that refused to stay silent. As he read the letters found inside the box, Daniel pieced together the tragic story of Emily Hart, a young woman whose life had ended too soon. The blood-stained scarf belonged to her, a keepsake lost in the chaos of a forgotten crime. Emily's letters spoke of fear and despair, of a powerful man who had used influence to silence her and cover up the truth. Her words were desperate pleas for justice and remembrance. Digging deeper, Daniel discovered that the case had been swept under the rug decades ago, filed away as an accident, the perpetrators shielded by wealth and connections. Emily's spirit, it seemed, had never found peace, trapped within the very evidence meant to prove her innocence. The sheriff shared his findings with retired officers and town elders, many of whom expressed regret and sorrow. One old detective recalled strange noises and unexplained phenomena around the evidence room years before, a chilling confirmation that the locker had long been a nexus of unrest. The jail's oppressive atmosphere made more sense now. The screams, footsteps, and flickering shadows were echoes of Emily's pain, refusing to be ignored. As Daniel reviewed the diary entries and case files, he felt the weight of the town's past pressing down on him. The injustice was not just historical, it lingered, infecting the present with sorrow and unrest. That night, the paranormal activity reached a crescendo. The radio in the evidence room burst to life, broadcasting a fragmented message: "Find truth, free me." The sheriff realized that Emily's spirit was reaching out through the very tools of justice, crying for recognition and release. Daniel's resolve hardened. The diary and the box were more than relics. They were calls for justice that had to be answered. But the deeper he ventured into the truth, the more dangerous the haunting became. Shadows seemed to move with purpose, doors slammed violently, and unseen forces tested his courage. The sheriff faced a choice: turn away from the darkness, or confront the injustice that had bound Emily's spirit and threatened the peace of Millfield. The diary's pages whispered of secrets and sacrifice, and Daniel knew that solving the mystery was the only way to silence the screams. The evidence locker had screamed once, but it demanded a reckoning, and Sheriff Daniel Collins was ready to answer. Sheriff Daniel Collins stood in the dimly lit evidence room, the unmarked wooden box resting on the table before him. Beside him, Father Samuel Clark clutched a small crucifix, his calm presence a beacon amid the mounting tension. They had gathered what little information they could from the diary entries, the forgotten case files, and the whispered stories of townsfolk who dared to remember. The air felt thick, charged with an otherworldly energy as Daniel prepared to confront the restless spirit tied to the box. Father Clark began reciting prayers softly, his voice steady, weaving ancient words meant to bring peace and banish torment. As the prayer flowed through the room, the temperature dropped sharply. Shadows writhed along the walls, twisting and stretching as if alive. The radio, silent for hours, suddenly crackled to life with a piercing scream, a sound so raw and anguished it sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. From the darkness emerged the translucent figure of Emily Hart, her eyes filled with sorrow and longing. "Why do you disturb me?" she whispered, voice fragile yet powerful. "Will you uncover the truth? Will you free me?" Daniel met her gaze with solemn resolve. "Emily, your story will be told. Justice will be served." The spirit's form flickered as unseen forces resisted the impending release. The room trembled, papers flew off desks, lights flickered erratically, shadows coalesced into grim faces, manifestations of those who sought to keep the past buried. Father Clark's prayers intensified, the crucifix glowing softly. Daniel read aloud from the diary, words of confession and hope, recounting the truth that had long been hidden. The battle between light and darkness waged within the evidence room. The screams rose and fell, a terrifying symphony of pain and release. With a final burst of radiant light, the shadowy figures dissipated, their hold broken. Emily's spirit smiled, a serene expression of gratitude, before dissolving into a gentle glow that faded into the still air. Silence settled over the room, heavy but peaceful. Daniel and Father Clark exchanged weary but victorious looks. The evidence locker, once a source of terror, now held the promise of closure. The unmarked box was carefully sealed and placed in the archives, its secrets laid bare, but respectfully preserved. As dawn approached, Sheriff Collins felt a profound shift within himself. He had faced the darkness and brought light to a forgotten soul. Yet he understood that some battles leave lasting marks, and the echoes of justice may linger in places unseen. The evidence locker no longer screamed, but its story would forever resonate, a reminder that truth, no matter how buried, demands to be heard. Sheriff Daniel Collins stood outside the old jailhouse as dawn painted the sky with soft hues of orange and pink. The heavy burden that had pressed on his shoulders for weeks, the screams, the shadows, and the restless spirit trapped within the evidence locker, had finally lifted. The air around the building felt lighter, almost as if the weight of years of silence and sorrow had been released with the breaking day. Inside the station, the once feared evidence locker now sat quietly, its door locked with a new sense of respect rather than dread. The unmarked wooden box, the source of so much anguish, had been carefully catalogued and stored, its secrets no longer hidden, but honored. News of Sheriff Collins's encounter spread through Millfield, weaving itself into the town's tapestry of stories and legends. Some whispered in disbelief, others nodded with knowing eyes, recalling the long-forgotten pain that had haunted their community. The sheriff's bravery had given voice to those silenced by time and injustice, rekindling a sense of collective memory and responsibility. At the community center, families connected to the victims gathered for a memorial service, lighting candles and sharing stories that had been lost in the shadows. Flowers adorned the steps of the courthouse, and a plaque was unveiled near the jailhouse, a tribute to those who suffered and a promise to remember. Daniel found himself changed. The experience had deepened his understanding of justice, not merely as law and order, but as empathy, remembrance, and the courage to face the unseen. The diary he had discovered became a symbol of that journey, preserved carefully for future generations to learn from. Late at night, when the town was silent, Daniel often felt a gentle presence nearby, a subtle warmth, a whispered thank you carried on the breeze. He no longer feared these moments, but embraced them as reminders of the delicate balance between the living and the departed. His deputies noticed a quiet strength in the sheriff, a thoughtful gaze that lingered on the old walls and shadows of the jailhouse. They too learned to respect the mysteries that dwelled just beyond human understanding. Though the locker no longer screamed, and the spirit had found peace, Daniel knew that some echoes never fully fade. The jailhouse remained a place where history lived, not only in stone and steel, but in the stories whispered between the walls. Sheriff Daniel Collins stood vigilant, guardian of law and memory, ready to face whatever shadows might arise. Because some stories transcend time, living on in the hearts of those brave enough to listen. And though the night was quiet now, the voices of the past would never be forgotten.